Hi, welcome to Kini Talks. Today we have the honor of inviting Dr. James Gomez, a Singaporean scholar as well as an activist, to be with us to talk about the issues of the latest, latest social movement in Singapore. Hi James, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me here. Happy to be always on KiniTV.
Okay. Lately, there's a protest in Hong Lim Park regarding the CPF, CPF system, which is very similar to Malaysia EPF system.
Right.
But maybe you can walk us through what's the unhappiness or about the CPF in Singapore.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the CPF is quite a complicated issue, but essentially it's compulsory savings by Singaporeans, and usually it's used for three major elements: healthcare, retirement, and household purchase. I think the issue that is in the news today is about the huge protests. And also the defamation suit brought by the Prime Minister against Roy, a blogger who has been writing about these issues. So in a nutshell, there are two key problems. First, it's called the minimum sum. So CPF account holders, when they reach 55, have to now retain a minimum of 155,000 Singapore dollars. Okay. And this is a source of concern and irritation for quite a number of CPF account holders, because in the past, Singaporeans who turn 55 essentially could withdraw all their money. And this has been traditionally used for, funding children's wedding, their overseas education, starting a business, and of course, also on the downside, some have, mismanaged their funds, and all this money has gone. But essentially, at 55, you take out all of your money and you manage it as you see fit.
As it was practiced in Malaysia.
Yes. Yeah. And also in Australia, because you could also withdraw the money at 55 and now 60. But with the introduction of minimum sum that has been a few years in the making, the current amount of 155,000 that has to be retained is a source for irritation, because first, people who have traditionally been looking forward to this money and in using the money in some strategic way for their needs, may not able to withdraw all of their money. Right. The assumption is, many people would not have much left over. So if they have to retain 155,000 Singapore dollars in the CPF account, they may not have much left over to kind of, deal with their, financial needs or strategies. So this is one problem, and the thinking behind some Singaporeans' view is this is their money, and they have right to sort of take it all away. So the government thinks that this money is required and consolidated into a retirement account, and then dispersed after the individual is 65. So that becomes a sort of a forced pension saving. So that's one issue. The second issue is the returns on this forced savings. Right now, there is a fixed rate of 2.5%, risk-free, it is said, and guaranteed for these CPF savings. There have been some adjustments to 4% for some selected accounts like the Medisave and retirement accounts, and the ordinary accounts may get a top-up of 1%. But overall, the thinking is that these returns on the CPF are not adequate, because the assumption here is the government, through its wealth fund agencies, actually uses this money to invest overseas. Right. And there's some debate over this, and it's a technical issue to get clarity. But that's the thinking that drives the unhappiness, and even and the returns by the government have been put up to even at amounts of 16%. So there's a perceived gap
So it means that the people perceive the government use their money to invest in.
So there's a perception.
Earn a lot of money.
Yes.
But then only very little return.
Returns. So this is a double whammy. So this is where blogger Roy comes into the picture. He has been articulating, these issues through articles in his blog, and the Prime Minister, through his lawyers, have suggested that in one of these articles he may be defamed through the language used in the article. But this is interesting because it also happened at a time when protests, around the CPF issue was raised. The local media have reported different numbers, but let's say it is significantly large number of people who turned up. A few thousand, yes. And so that has, not only put Roy, the individual, on the map, but it has put the pension fund issue clearly on the map. And this is one of the developments here. Given that we are now in midway 2014, we have turned the corner towards the second half of the time period in which the election has to be called. So I foresee the CPF would be an important election issue that will come up, among many other things. But of course, if we are also talking about elections, we also need to talk about individuals. So there's some speculation on the ground whether this young man, Roy, might even become a candidate. It is not unusual for people made famous by the PAP's attack on them, and in this case Roy, to emerge as a lightning rod during the elections. But these are just sort of market discussion. It remains to be seen whether this would happen.
But talking, in terms of political economy, I think the issues in Asia is that even Malaysia, Singapore, Japan, China as well, the government are actually using people's forced saving, huge amount of forced saving to invest in, and government linked fund to invest, and it has been a sort of a traditional method to do investment to build up so-called Asian economy. Right. But people have little transparency about how the fund being run, and also the fund is actually being run by the government. More or less it's the same in a lot of countries. Yeah,
I guess it is, but at the same time, I think people want to say, okay, if you are investing forced savings, then give us the necessary good returns, and I think. And don't hold our money back, after a fixed stage. So I think these two issues come into play. But talking about politics, I think most media reports, focus a lot on the CPF issues and of course the blogger. But I think it's also important to focus on the other actor here, which is the Prime Minister. I think what is interesting for me, looking at this whole issue, is that the office of the Prime Minister, right, is more and more pushed down to the ground, in the sense that in the blogger's case, he was able to crowdsource, and I think the latest figures put it at 110,000 Singapore dollars. So, it seems that people are willing to support a stand vis-a-vis the office of the Prime Minister. And if we kind of pull that towards the elections as well, you can see in the last two elections, the Prime Minister's ward has also been challenged. And in both instances, the candidates in the opposition scoring over 30%. So I foresee in the next elections that his ward would also be contested, and it remains to be seen what kind of percentage any opposition team there can muster against his constituency. if you look at anecdotal evidence and evidence on news reports, online or offline, you will see that different parties are actively walking the ground in this constituency. So from that perspective, I think we also see a strengthening of opposition also against the office of the Prime Minister. So, and that I think is one of the interesting things in this incident.
I think after the last election, I think the Prime Minister office and our Singapore PAP leadership has been very sensitive about monitoring and responding. So, but then instead they make the case worse, or they go and sue the bloggers.
Right.
They were put in the fix, right? They have to respond to, but then of course their response is sledgehammer, like overreacted, and actually put up, actually raise the profile of the other side.
Yes, and they also invited questions. So, for example, one of the incidents or issues that came up through this was the questioning on what authority the Prime Minister's office and its associated staff could issue press releases and rebuttal, through the support staff of the Prime Minister's office. And this was questioned, and using online platforms. And the Prime Minister's office had to respond and saying that it was justified and proper protocol, to use support staff from the Prime Minister's office to respond to the media or letters to the press and stuff like that. So you can see that this incident has invited a lot of questioning, if anything, watering down, any kind of fear people may have had against the office of the Prime Minister. So that represents an overall trend within Singapore. There's less fear. There's less fear, and people are willing to put money to it, as we saw in the case of the crowdsourcing. But of course, as observers of Singapore, maybe your viewers might be wondering, so if this has happened, so what will be the state's strategy? Typically, they will always like to, block the holes, right? So in this case, I foresee, maybe not immediately, but gradually, they might introduce rules to control how one crowdsources online, because we have one of the most comprehensive online regimes when it comes to political expression and even online media and so on. I foresee this might be in the card. So my recommendation is, before the rules are up, you better start crowdsourcing for some money.
You allow the Hong Lim Park loosening a bit after the last election or previous election. Try to loosen up a bit. The leadership try to be more people friendly, appear lined up, buying foods and stuff like that. But on the other hand, when you give up some space and it's not being controlled by them, they will still want to close it up. It's like sort of like
I think we've had some space. I think what's happening now is those space are being used fully. I don't think we have had new space. I think that may have to come, really through a change of government, to change of laws. We have a certain amount of space and some creative use of space online, and that has helped significantly. But even then, they have tried to come and, close off the corners, so to speak. So, but I think what we have is, as in many parts of the Asian political economies, in this part of the world, I think you have a more emboldened citizenry, and that is interesting. But at the same time, when we talk about citizenry, I think we also need to be careful and also include the whole host of immigrants, new immigrants, foreign labor, new citizens. They also bring a new mix to the electoral game. So in Singapore, one of the thinking right now in the public domain is that there has been a significant number of new citizens, There's been a fair number of Singaporeans also marrying foreign nationals who have become PRs or new citizens as well, and they might be an important voting factor moving up to the next elections, and this will be a new phenomena that we need to bring into our analysis. In the past, many of the societies in the region, Malaysia, Singapore included, we used to dissect our electoral results in terms of ethnicity or religious groups and so on. But I think now we may have to bring in a new slice of analysis, looking at how even new citizens may be voting. That will, be very much on the cards.
But can we summarize up? Means there's active online activism that translates itself in on the ground. Now, I mean, so-called bear or the fruit of of after so many years of active online activism has some effect on the ground. But it may not be translated to electoral success because maybe in Singapore cases you have new voters coming in and stuff like that. And
the electoral system has not changed. So we'll have to look at the constituency structure. We have the GRC, or the group representative constituency, that still brings out lopsided results. But if we take the result of the last election, we can see we almost have full participation. So one also will have to keep an eye on electoral boundary changes and even tweaking to the electoral system. So that's definitely something those watching Singapore need to look at.
Right. But on the other hand, we are looking at the new. Can I conclude that there's a new wave of activists, younger activists, and they actually has more. It's like something that really touched on the ground and touching the voices of people, representing voices of people on the ground, and they're very young, and it's quite brave in the actual situation. So I mean, after Hsien as a quite a tragic figure, in Singapore politics, and now here comes someone who is openly challenged, who is openly having the sue, losing his jobs. And even and we see a few young activists who openly challenge to be sued. So
certainly we have a whole range of sort of civil society representatives or groups on the scene. Some are formally registered, some are informal, some are online. You have a range of political parties, but I think it needs to evolve one step further. I think what Singapore is lacking is at two levels. One, a broader NGO coalition forming to take on big issues. There's some movement towards there, but I think we can perhaps look out for more strengthening along those lines. In that sense, I think civil society is working a little bit better in terms of going in that direction. We also need to look at the opposition parties to see whether there can be enough traction to form some kind of broad alliance. And finally, whether there could be a civil society political party alliance to inflict regime change. So I think we are still early stages, but I can foresee that in the next election, we will take a bigger step towards that direction. So I will see maybe a rather loose, possibly weak effort at forming some kind of coalition, but I think it will strengthen moving forward from there.
Right. But I heard some criticism about the opposition. Yes, we describe it as breakthrough, right? But I mean, maybe on the ground, the young people would want it to be a bit more critical, radicalized. Instead of, the opposition are saying, the Workers' Party saying the co-pilot, trying to awake the driver, main driver, right?
Sure.
But there are some voices want them to do a bit more, So there's the tension.
Certainly, because I think it's also part of people's learning. I think people are quite eager to support the opposition, so that's a blanket support. But I think as the opposition makes gains, I think people will then be looking at the quality of the opposition and what kind of values and position a particular opposition party stands for. So I think in that sense, the Singapore electorate will continue to take more steps forward to clarify for themselves, when you say opposition, what kind of opposition party and what they stand for.
Yeah.
So I think, again, it's another journey that the electorate will have to make. But I think what is also interesting that is coming out in the discussion is you'll find there has been less criticism of the opposition as such.
Okay.
Quite a lot of the criticism, is between the 60% and the 40%. You'll understand it if you know Singapore politics and the last elections. Essentially, 60% voted for the ruling party and 40% for the opposition. So you have arguments that Singapore politics can only move forward if the 60% realize that things are really bad and they really need to step up and vote for change. So you find that seems to be a predominant discourse, especially if you follow online. So there's some effort to not just look at political parties, because ultimately the political parties can only do so much. The electorate is the key. So you'll find that, comments like 60% wake up, is this what you want? Is this the kind of... for example, CPF issue, you want to inherit, So if you continue to vote for the ruling party, this is what you're going to get. So that's also becoming increasing. So from a campaign point of view, I think you will find that in efforts to move forward, that people will be talking within the family, among their friends, to say, hey, perhaps you got to change, because the campaign is on the ground, it's citizen to citizen campaign, so
very
it's
organic.
just trying to get the other 60% to see if they can come on board to bring in regime change.
But isn't it there's some fear about there's some sort of xenophobic kind of discussion? I mean, simple discussion. We and them, Singaporean first, and those who are new immigrants and. Especially from mainland China. So sort of kind of tension.
I think in the early discussion it was positioned as xenophobic, but really, I mean, it's not as simple as that. You need to go to the ground. Essentially, it's a question of cost of living. So the locals find wages are depressed, they can't get jobs, they lose jobs to foreigners, and they think the labor policies and immigration policies are not reflective of local workers' needs. And that is the crux. It's a cost of living issue, right? So, and I think it's not unique to any society. I mean, you go to Europe, and this is the problem of the big companies, the globalization, the big companies. They're moving everywhere to places where governments are willing to give them lower corporate taxes, where governments are allowing them to hire workers at very cheap rates. Having said that, I think we also need to look at the condition of some foreign workers in Singapore, because many of them pay large agent fees to come to Singapore to work, but they may work 3 or 5 years and may not make enough money to pay such agent fees. Many do not live well. So I think it's quite a complex issue and cannot be simply reduced to xenophobia. Cost of living, for local workers is a real issue.
But what has the ruling elites been doing? I mean, from our observation, we can see that some of the response is still very stiff, very traditional. Trying to punish somebody. So there's still some effort over there. But on the other hand, of course, try to make themselves very friendly on the ground. So sort of kind of both patriarchy, but as well as a bit more friendly kind of image. But what do you think of what's the thinking of the elites, how they are going to respond?
Here, when we say elites, I mean, we often, talk about the ruling party, but it's very important to put the spotlight on the Singapore bureaucracy. They run the country, right? When they speak that we are the government, the bureaucrats use such language. So it's the thinking there. I mean, it's a machine that's pretty, large, not nimble to move. There's a certain kind of ideological mindset there. So this, I think, to some extent, is what is holding Singapore back and holding change. So any political regime that comes into power may have to seriously look at also bureaucratic change.
Yeah.
You can't just do a political party change. You need to look at the senior bureaucrats, and like in many countries, when there is regime change, it's not just at the political level, it's at the bureaucratic level. If you look at our part of the world, you'll find when all the indigenous elites came into power, the first thing they did was to take away, all the colonial remnants in the bureaucracy. So any change in government would require some change in the bureaucracy. Otherwise, you can't effect good policy change.
But bureaucracy, I mean, from Malaysian perspective, Singapore is very efficient.
Yeah.
So it's too efficient, But yeah, so, but sometimes they may be a bit of ruthless, mathematically, too calculative.
Yeah, but efficient doesn't mean good.
Yeah, may not be,
I've been in the Malaysian system. I know it has been slow, but I guess people just want a good life, and I think the bureaucracy, is something that we don't often talk about in Singapore, but certainly something to pay attention. I would think that political change cannot really remain just at the political level. I think it also needs to involve some level of bureaucratic change.
But then the people would only look at one person, the leadership, right? And the Prime Minister. So I mean the spotlight, whether you like it or not, will be observing, speculating his thinking, and attacking his weakness, or criticizing him, or somebody trying to engage with him and stuff like that. So, but then of course there's and the rise of the the new wave of protests and stuff like that seems to be challenging whatever So can we say that the current leadership has in terms of political legitimacy being challenged? I mean, there's some deficit in terms of.
Sure, I think that like in most regimes, right, the legitimacy comes from the fact that you can't provide for the people. And the policies, certainly have resulted in high cost of living and also competition for jobs.
Yeah.
So the legitimacy has eroded from that point of view. And I think if you try to suppress your citizens from speaking up more, they will rebel, and that's what has happened. But then again, we'll have to see if the rebellion is strong enough to inflict a regime change. And even if we did at the party political level, what I'm saying is that's not enough. One has to go deeper and look at the bureaucracy as well. So, any slate, I don't expect any single political party to sweep into power. It'll probably be some form of coalition, if it comes to that, would have to have a bureaucratic reshaping in mind. Yeah, and that's going to be an important challenge. Most of the time, why regimes who make that transition cannot stay on, it's because the bureaucracy resists. And that will be a real problem in Singapore.
But I mean, what kind of changes would you think of bureaucracy should be? I mean, reduce in size or reduce in participation in the public life? Letting the people make more decisions.
Yeah. I think we need to have more transparency in the bureaucracy in terms of where the policies come from and its implementation. I think just going back to the CPF issue, right? One of the criticism leveled against the blogger is he may not have built his argument with all the information necessary to build the argument. And that's a good point to make, but then, one must also have access to such information. And we always have a situation where we do not have such information. For example, if we say we have a lot of foreign workers in Singapore, and that's a fact, and we can put some numbers to it, but if you ask for a breakdown in terms of the countries of origin, that is not available.
Yeah, I mean, we find it quite curious in Singapore, this kind of discourse on credibility and backed with data. So, sort of that and a lot of data to really back up your credibility.
That's right.
Yeah, but in discourse in Malaysia, it won't be like that. I mean,
Sure, but eventually, politics is an emotional matter. I mean, facts and figures can support the case, but it's also how much hurt people feel. Right, and I think there's a lot of hurt, financial hurt actually in Singapore, and something that cannot be fixed, I don't think, in the run-up to the next GE.
Yeah, but I mean, so next GE, but the opposition should have a better platform, right? It's looking at the general trends, but then the issues of the split within the opposition parties, the figure, the ego, and then maybe a new or more new parties coming up. So some said maybe Singapore need a collective figure to bring everyone together. What's your thinking about it?
Well, I think there needs to be more dialogue within parties. Some parties think they already have some advantage, so they may not think it's in their best political interest to cooperate with others. Others want to cooperate because it's in their interest to do so. But having said that, I believe that the discourse to cooperate will be exercised. Now, for observers, the outcome may not be satisfactory because I think how much cooperation you will get in the run-up to the election remains to be seen. My view is political parties will only cooperate, and not in Singapore but elsewhere too, only if they feel that the public wants them to cooperate. So if there's not enough public outcry or negative reaction to cooperate, the parties won't cooperate. They can get away with it. Now, I know there's some rumblings within the voters that there should be some kind of cooperation. I've not heard more. So we'll have to see how loud voter sentiment is. And if the voter sentiment is not loud enough, efforts of cooperation may not be that successful. Yeah.
So how do you rate the possibility, like Singapore, to have something like PR in Singapore, the United?
I think it's inevitable. It's inevitable. I think you may not have all opposition parties in a coalition makeup in these elections, but I think you'll have quite a lot. Yeah, so I don't think you'll have so much major fragmentation. I think there will be efforts to cooperate and avoid three-corner fights, but I think there will be. And there is three-corner fights everywhere, in any jurisdiction you go. So if it's not the top two contenders, I think anyone that comes in on a three or four-corner fight will find themselves, getting very low votes and possibly even losing their deposit.
How do you assess the young activists coming? Would they stay on, or would they just shine and then go? I mean, now you have a new generation of activists and Roy
and others. Yes. Activists need to eat. The problem with Singapore is
sustainability.
To have funds, to be employed. So many activists, of course, have full-time jobs and maybe keep a low profile. So you'll find, like in the case of Roy, once he's in the public domain, the employers cut him off. This is to be expected in any environment, right? Because of perceived reputation damage to the organization, or so-called conflict of interest issues. Once you are in the line of fire, organizations will just cut you off. So I think what is missing for young people coming both to public life, whether in civil society or political party, there needs to be some kind of counseling, mentoring of shared experience. Many of them step up without understanding the risk. So if you're counseled beforehand to say, hey, okay, you are in job X in company A, this will only last for so long, right? Because once you're in the public line, eventually, they'll push you out. So and if you want to stay on, how do you stay on? We don't have many, like in Malaysia, alternative businesses where you could, still to get a job or income and then do your contribution to society. So Singapore is, in that sense, still singular. But because Singapore is small, you'll find many, work abroad now. So that also, so the region helps in sustaining some of them, and I find that young people, will for a time be in the forefront, but if they can't work or get work in Singapore, they will explore things in the region, and that's becoming a new phenomenon in Singapore.
Right. So, what do you predict about the next? Next few years. Will things get better, or remain the same, or worsen?
I can't. Any government would want to try to improve its lot, and the bureaucracy included, to come up with new ideas, to roll out things. A few things have been announced in terms of healthcare. These things will be rolled out in the year or two, in time to, hopefully, from the ruling party's point of view, towards an election success for it. But at the same time, I think no matter how much effort is put in, there's still a lot of cost of living issues.
So more like structural issues.
That's right. And you can't send all your foreign workers back, because otherwise you create a collapse of the economy. So can you wean them out, or do you still need more? And these are going to be ongoing issues. And I think in 2 years, they are very much going to be around. And they will play into the issue of the day during the elections.